Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Our special guest today is Rob Showers, principal at the firm of Simms Showers LLP. Rob has had a long and storied career in law. Prior to founding Simms Showers, he was a principal at Gammon and Grange, where he was in charge of the litigation department, and before that was with the U.S. Department of Justice, where he was acting Deputy Assistant Attorney General. He was both a federal prosecutor and chief of the civil section in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and served as founder and executive director of what is now the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section. Rob has rightly earned a national reputation on law. He lectures extensively nationwide, and he writes a number of articles on church and nonprofit law, sexual misconduct, legal defense of ministries, and presently serves as one of the editors of the Nonprofit and Church Law Reporter. He's an expert in many areas and was kind enough to spend some time talking with us about the recent changes in the Title IX guidance that were issued by the Department of Education. Hello, Rob. How are you today?
Good, Drum.
Well, I've been looking forward to having you on the show. We initially met at the TRACS conference, the Transnational Association for Christian Colleges, their annual meeting, and you just did a bang-up job about talking about a wake-up call that higher ed is having right now with respect to sexual abuse and their liabilities. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Glad to. The problem is that for so long, women hadn't been taken seriously in their allegations of sexual misconduct, particularly sexual harassment. In the secular environment, they obviously are, and you've got all kinds of media stories where that's true of. I mean, we can start with the Bill Cosby or the Roger Ailes or Weinstein or all of the other things, or the Supreme Court nominee being accused, but there is clearly, I would say, a swell, which they're calling the Me2 Movement, that's having an impact in the world and with secular institutions. However, with religious institutions, I think so many of them thought until recently that they were somehow immune. And my words to them is that you are not immune from the sexual harassment claims that are coming from a liability or public relations standpoint. And you're not immune that it used to be, if this ever happens. The answer is it's no longer if this ever happens, meaning sexual harassment claims that are going to happen at your college or university or your organization. They are going to happen, and the question you have is, what are we going to do about them?
I think that's a big wake-up call for many higher ed institutions. Unfortunately, it is part of the culture that we live in, the times we live in, and it's not a matter of belittling or minimizing the challenges that many women have faced and continue to face in the workplace. I think a lot of it has to do with just everyone being aware of how their actions impact other people. What do you think?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, one of the wake-up calls are that students in colleges are more at risk of experiencing sexual violence than any other crime. And the studies are replete with showing that now 4 out of 5 female students never report to law enforcement, but I think that's going to change. More than 50% of the college sexual assaults take place generally against freshman students, and I think those complaints are going to come. And by the way, freshman students, they may be under 18, which would trigger not just sexual harassment, but all of the child abuse laws that would come in play, mandatory reporting and all of the increased scrutiny that would come. And so what you're seeing in this tsunami is, again, colleges, universities, and religious organizations being just at risk as much as any of the secular colleges, universities, and organizations. And so, as I mentioned, they have to say to themselves, okay, Do we have a policy? Do we have training? Do we have transparency? What is it that we're looking for in the preventive measures for sexual harassment particularly?
Have you seen a change in the stance of the courts on the way they look at these type of events nowadays?
I have, and I think you have too, in just the media presentation. First of all, whether we like it or not, juries are simply 6 or 12 people picked out of our citizenry, and they're all watching the same media, social and regular media, that we are. And so I think when a jury comes to a judge, someone who's accused of sexual harassment, or an institution that maybe didn't handle sexual harassment claims the way they should have, they're basically, we laughed and said, before they were innocent until they were proved guilty. I think the Me2 movement has almost switched that to say they are guilty until they prove themselves innocent. And I think juries and judges you're seeing more and more of that mindset.
And that doesn't surprise me at all, especially given the most recent Supreme Court hearings that we saw in Washington.
Exactly. Kavanaugh was, an example of that. You simply could almost contrast and compare the Thomas hearings with the Kavanaugh hearings and see the sentiment between the two.
Very true. And, without getting into the whole politics of the situation, which everyone believes a certain way that they do, and most of the time you're not going to convince the other person of the way you believe. I think the important point is that it doesn't really matter whether you subscribe to or covered by Title IX, you're still at risk.
Right. I mean, Title IX, as you know, there's been new Title IX guidance that's out, but some colleges and universities, particularly the religious ones who don't accept Title IV funding, won't be subject to those. But I don't think that's really going to matter, because while there have been some changes that have, in essence, made sexual assaults and sexual harassment a lot more easy to bring against colleges and universities, I think the real risk is that the Me2 movement have made the culture, obviously, a lot more receptive to sexual harassment claims and reports, and women as well as men, but women primarily, are reporting it at a much higher rate. And so, as I mentioned before, I think the first thing that a college university president has to think about is, okay, do we have a sexual harassment policy that is going to stand up under the modern day scrutiny? Let me give you some examples. Is there a clear definition of sexual harassment, including same-sex harassment, in my policy? Do I have an unambiguous statement that such conduct is strictly prohibited? 3, do I have a clear description of how an employee or volunteer can lodge a complaint and the process of completion of the investigation? Do I have a clear statement that retaliation against reporting harassment is strictly prohibited? In the policy, do I have a confidentiality statement about such complaints? Do I have an assurance that the complaints will be promptly investigated by objective professionals, separate the alleged victim from the alleged perpetrator? And I make that comment because, believe it or not, there's an allegation and they never really do anything to separate the person who's alleging the sexual harassment from the person they're saying perpetrated it, which you would think is logical, but I've run into many circumstances where they haven't done that. In your policy, do you have a clear statement that if the allegations are substantiated, that disciplinary action will follow, but the investigation will have a conclusion? And most importantly, do you have a training process that moves this policy into practice, given to all of your employees and your volunteers? Those are probably, I just went through sort of the 8 main things that I would say, if you look at your policy and take a look at guiding that, I think that would be very helpful. Drum, I've written a couple articles that certainly I would allow your podcast people to access on our website, sort of part 1, part 2 on handling sexual harassment in the Me Too culture. And I think that will give some of the clear components.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. And thanks for those great tips. In the training that you talked about, because the training is critical, not only from a process perspective, but raising people's awareness as to what may be considered by someone else being sexual harassment. What are some of the key things that they should cover?
Well, first of all, you cover what the definition is. Unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. The new standard is in Title IX is unwelcome sexual conduct or unwelcome conduct on the basis of sex that's so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively denies someone equal access to education. Regardless of which one you use, I like the short one, unwelcome sexual conduct. If that's what it is, then you have to say to them, you have to take these allegations seriously. You have to reassure the individual who brings the allegation their voice is going to be heard. And these allegations will be investigated accordingly. You're probably going to have to investigate without delay, and you're certainly going to have to investigate without bias. So you're looking at someone who's objective, who's going to be thorough in the investigation and timely, and it's not going to take months or years to get through. Those are some of the things in the training that you're going to have to begin to train them on. But I think probably the most important thing is, what is sexual harassment? If someone complains, how do you convince them, they're going to be taken seriously, their voice is going to be heard, an investigation will be done, and it'll be done objectively and thoroughly, and that we will have a conclusion. That's important for people to understand, and whether it be employees or volunteers.
It makes perfect sense. Have you got a couple of stories you might be able to tell where folks have maybe omitted something along these lines and it's come back to bite them in the you-know-where?
Well, yeah, a couple generic stories without obviously revealing attorney-client privilege.
Of course.
I've had a number of them, which I mentioned earlier, where there'll be a sexual harassment complaint against a professor, and they basically make the student stay in that class and finish the class or get an F, and do not remove the perpetrator and abuser. They easily can put them in another class or allow them to do something else while the investigation is doing it. And in a couple circumstances, it turned out that they were basically re-victimized during that time period, because they had to go in and have interaction with the professor or with the person who was alleged to be the perpetrator, and they were re-victimized, which all this does is it starts, not only is it a PR nightmare, but it starts adding zeros to the end of the verdict.
Yeah, that's not a good thing. You would think something that simple would come to people's mind, but I think that just goes to how little people understand what they really need to do when something like this happens. I know there's training programs out there, and I'd be willing to bet that you guys do those type of things as well with your clients.
All the time, and we do, and as you know, I do these kind of trainings across the country. Another example, though, is what used to happen is that a lot of these sexual harassment complaints were simply filed away and nothing was done about it. And when that happens, that just exacerbates the issue. Whether it's true or false, you need to take it seriously and investigate it. The other thing that I found is that you have to decide, how are you going to do an objective investigation that's going to be unbiased? And I think that in many cases, you can do that internally, but in some cases, you're going to need to have somebody externally do that. And when I recommend that they do external, the one thing I'd recommend is you get a law firm who is skilled in this arena, who will be able to keep the appropriate protections both for the university as well as for the victim.
It doesn't surprise me that there would be firms, and not necessarily law firms, but just organizations who are out there who are starting to specialize in these type of things. Have you seen that?
Yes, there are a number of law firms that have this. Ours is one, that we can do these kind of investigations. There are a number of others to do that, because basically the public wants tangible but objective results, and the victim wants quick and decisive action and results. And if, in fact, they are, it's basically done as an inside job by friends of the person who's alleged to be the perpetrator, regardless of what's discovered, that investigation is tainted. And now it's not objective and it's biased. And like I said, even if they come to the right conclusion, it will not be seen seriously.
And that's challenging because that's really when it's not looked at as an objective solution, an objective fallout from it. Then you get people angry on both sides, and that's what leads to further lawsuits.
Right. And sexual harassment claims are particularly difficult to investigate because oftentimes it's a he said, she said. There isn't a lot of corroborating evidence. There is not a lot of documentary evidence showing it happened one way or another. It's a lot of direct testimony that this has happened. They say, no, it didn't happen. And where do you go from there? And so already you have a very, very difficult case. Unlike other cases, you would have corroborating witnesses, you'd have corroborating evidence, you'd have some documents prove one way or another. That's why it's so important that you retain an objective and professional investigator that will keep confidentiality for both the alleged victims and perpetrators, as well as the university, that they show there's no bias on either side. I mean, there's a lot of groups that are victim advocates groups that are posing as independent investigators, and that's no good either, because they obviously have made up their minds that whatever they see, they're going to see it through a prism of the victim is always right. Well, you really need the objective, unbiased investigation, and that's why I generally look towards non-biased attorneys and investigators who are outside the university when you have more serious claims and allegations. The minor ones could be done internally, but they still have to be looked at as, will this, when they look at the investigation and the investigators, will the victim and the public see this as unbiased and objective? That's the question you have to ask yourself.
And it makes perfect sense that they do ask themselves. There probably should be some sort of department or division within the university to deal with this specifically, but they also should know when it's critical to look at outside counsel or outside investigation.
Right. And that's generally why I think when these investigations happen, it's probably important. Most colleges have outside counsel, if not inside counsel, legal counsel. And I think they need to run these by them. And if the counsel has some expertise in that, they'll be able to make that call or help them make that call. Before, it probably was as important because the stakes were not as high. Today, the stakes are not just high in dollars, but in public relations. And obviously, that's going to translate into dollars somewhere along the way. So it's important that colleges and universities and other organizations get this right the first time.
Absolutely. Not only for the institution perspective, but for the people who were involved in it as well.
Absolutely. I think that's critical. One of the other things that I've run into is, and you've been hearing a lot of this, I mean, this happened, obviously, this is the Kavanaugh case, historical sexual abuse allegations. And what I mean is they just didn't happen yesterday or a month ago, but they happened years ago, even decades ago. The problem with historical investigations in general are that, memories fade, witnesses are lost, any tangible evidence is lost, and you put that up against already a difficult sexual harassment or sexual abuse investigation, and you really do have a very, very complex and difficult case to investigate. And so that's even more reason why you need to get somebody who understands and has done these cases before and will call the balls and strikes objectively.
Absolutely. And the fallout is huge, not only from the reputation perspective, but what we're seeing with the Michigan State case that went on. The former president's been brought up on felony charges for lying to the police.
Right.
And hitting from a dollar perspective, their undergraduate applications have fallen by almost 8.5%. I mean, that's dollars to the bottom line because people don't feel safe coming to an institution, or they know the institution's reputation and they just say, I'm not willing to even expose myself to this.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's critical. And again, that with the Title IX changes that are relaxing the standards and heightening the enforcement against institutions, I think colleges and universities have got to put that at the top of their priorities. In fact, the question to me, Drum, I don't know if you remember, was asked, what legal challenges will most impact colleges and universities in the next 5 years? And I believe it's sexual misconduct, and how we handle that, I think, is probably, if not the number one issue, certainly in the top 3 issues that are going to impact colleges and universities for the future. And I think it's going to have a greater impact on, quite frankly, religious colleges and universities. And here's the reason. I think, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, that so many of these institutions feel like they're immune or that it's never going to happen here. And so they don't take the steps to really get the right policy, to get the right training, to get the right education involved in how to handle these kind of investigations and claims. And the problem is, if it does happen and they're completely unprepared, this could severely impact them. And it has in some colleges and universities. And I think religious are probably more vulnerable than even the secular ones in that regard.
It's like that old saying, doing the ostrich routine doesn't work because you've got 90% of your exposure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably going to say something a little controversial here, but it's the same thing if you would look at the church or religious nonprofits, how they dealt with child abuse in the first case. They were probably some of the last people to come around to that because they basically said it was never going to happen here, or God would not allow this to happen here, or whatever spiritual language they want to use. But the fact is, we live in a sinful world, a fallen world, and it is going to happen.
It is going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And like you said earlier, it's a matter of preparation and then being able to execute in the most objective and thoughtful way you possibly can.
I think you're right. I think it's important to understand that. So if I was to recap, I would say, let's look at the policy. Let's look at the training. Let's look at our investigative tools, and let's look at the trigger for when we do internal versus external investigations, and make sure that you really, if I was a college president or university or somebody in that regards, let's make sure I've really connected with a lawyer or law firm who understands how this all works. So going forward, I get the right advice. And it's like going to a doctor who, you need brain surgery and you go to a general practitioner.
Exactly. Well, Rob, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you so much. This is great advice for university presidents that they can take and put into action right away. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, Drum, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Rob Showers of Simms Showers. Rob, always a pleasure having you on the show, and look forward to the next time. Our next guest is Dr. Ron Crutcher, president of the University of Richmond, who will talk with us about the importance of mentoring with the younger generation and the impact it has had on his life and how he pays it forward in his leadership of the University of Richmond. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires 3 things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those 3 things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.